John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
As a supply chain consultant, can you tell me why segmentation is such a big issue right now?
I think it is with a lot of clients. Why? I think it's been around some time, and people have been, I think they've had a lot of good ideas to start with. A lot of things have gone on, but then they've reached a bit of a cul-de-sac. You know, people have lost sight of what they're trying to do. They've had some project which has been superficially successful. But actually it's not been producing success, and I think it's not a problem that's going away, because essentially people are trying to create one business on one hand and, you know, integrate their global business and so on, and at the other hand they know that their customers are getting more and more diverse and want more and more variety, and actually if you try and reconcile those, you can only do it through doing something with your supply chain, which is essentially segmentation. And the problem is, I think people are struggling to know what to do. And I think that's where people have got stuck. There's a few obvious things to do, but not actually able to progress it very far. So it kind of just keeps on coming back. Yeah.
What would be the top 3 obvious things to do that you would say to anybody asking right now in that position?
I think the key thing is actually not to take too much out of textbooks, and actually you need to work it out for each business. You know, actually go to what the characteristics of products are, or parts of the business. Let's not just go products. In you know, the particular circumstance a corporate client is in. So it's not just some out of a book solution. You actually need to work out a proper solution for the specific markets, product groups, manufacturing technologies that you're really trying to supply. And too many of these solutions have been just off the shelf, and you actually need to drill into them. So that's a long answer to number 1, but I think most of it hinges from that, which is, you know, the second thing you need to do is actually find out, you know, what are the characteristics of each of the products. And from that, you can actually find out which groups of products actually are significant enough in the business to make it worth the effort to segment. You know, to do, and by that I mean do something different, be it a simple, you know, very lean operation with minimum of costs, through to extremely agile, and, you know, defining what you mean by agile in those circumstances. Not sure that counts as 3, but...
And what is needed to make supply segmentation happen, rather than talking about it, as you say?
I think it is taking a much more analytical approach. It's too easy to find some easy early targets and to do some obvious things, and that creates some very clear, you know, we'll do this, we do that, and it looks successful. But actually it doesn't cover all the variety of products there is in the business, all the variety of customers. So you need to have a strategy which in effect is comprehensive for all the products. Then you actually know what to prioritise. And I think that does require hard analysis. I think, you know, segmentation's got to make the business easier, but actually working out what you're going to do is a pretty complicated operation. You know, it requires real depth of thinking. And at the moment, a lot of the time, it's some really complicated solutions are devised from really simple thinking. It needs to be the other way around. That's our view, and we're working, you know, across a lot of people who are, you know, in effect, everybody, every supply chain is working with segmentation, whether it's called that or not. And it's all a bit of a vague process at the moment that needs to be turned into something a good deal more rigorous. And then the solutions can be simple.
How do you foresee the next 12 to 18 months in terms of the development of supply chain segmentation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that it needs deeper thinking, and I think that's where people are at. I think a lot of people are very frustrated. It's sort of, in consumer goods terms, it's the same as the consumer goods businesses trying to work out their story with the retailers. They kind of never quite get to a proper solution, so they just keep on coming around to the problem again. Segmentation, I think people are ready for a new set of thinking on it, and I think people are going to start engaging with it a bit more vigorously. Do I actually think it'll go away and, become a non-issue? No, I think there's some really hard thinking to do. I think it's probably the most complicated thing that any company's got to do with their physical operations.
And what other issues do you see as top of the agenda for senior retail and FMCG professionals?
I think fundamentally it's the same as it's always been, which is it's been why are we so irrelevant and why do we get treated as the sort of people who just have to do things? I think the challenge for people who are really pushing forward is that they actually make themselves more commercially relevant, and I think segmentation is one of the ways they do that, i.e. it's not all about how factories are run and how factories are planned, it's how the whole supply chain performs from end to end. At that stage you start having some commercial leverage and people are going to start listening to supply chain people. In general, it's too easy to ignore the supply chain right now.
And how else would somebody in that position, aside from supply chain segmentation, put themselves more at the forefront of the business?
I think it's the old story that with retailers, you've got to put yourself on the front foot. There's too much just, that's the salesman area, and our problem is responding to what the salesman or the account manager says the retailer wants. The supply chain's got to be in retailer. I don't believe that there's any great value in the implant operations where hundreds of people are working free for Tesco's or Asda. I think it's very much more getting on the front foot intellectually, understanding what it is the retailer wants and actually making sure that that's what is being supplied. And it's not just a product thing, it's the whole service. It's the service model, and I think too many people are just looking at it in terms of trucks and sheds rather than actually satisfying what the retailer wants, because the retail business is increasingly complex, and I think most branded manufacturers, most suppliers just don't spend enough time understanding what's needed, and so they just respond to the pushbacks from retailers like they're random requests, and they're not.
And John, what do you see as the future trends in the industry?
I think the really interesting ones are where national market boundaries are being broken down and the big corporates are becoming one organisation. I think it's been talked about for a long time, and there's been steps to do it. I think people are starting to get more serious about it, and at that stage it really is going to become really complicated, the supply chain. At the moment there's the global centre of operations, and then there's what happens in the local markets, which is incredibly complicated and where huge amounts of costs are incurred, but it's largely invisible to the overall corporation. If the overall corporation is going to take an interest in those end markets, the scale of complexity is going to be hugely bigger. I think segmentation's part of that solution, but I think there's going to be some really interesting issues that are going to arise out of that, which I think many organisations haven't really started to explore. It's just seen as a cost reduction opportunity, which I think they're going to have a bit of a shock about, because many local markets, frankly, are still very, very different.
So, crystal ball, what should people be doing now to prepare for that future trend?
I think they need to have a very clear model of how end markets should operate and how that should run right through the organisation. I think too many supply chain organisations are great at running the global central supply chain, how factories operate, how suppliers deliver to factories, how factories deliver to regional distribution centres, but when it comes to the final market steps, it all becomes much more diffuse, and there needs to be, it's not going to be one model but multiple models of how you service different sorts of markets, but in a common way, and that I think is relatively unexplored. So it'd be good opportunities in that for everyone, I think.
You mentioned globalisation playing a more and more important role. How do emerging markets fit into that?
I think emerging markets, there's too much of a tendency of American and European businesses to assume that they can just apply their existing models into the new markets. I think, just simply underestimating the scale of China and India is one huge mistake. The second is just not getting detailed enough. I mean, in Western market, you can assume that you can supply goods and manage that as a separate supply chain activity. Our experience is if you're in India and China, you've got to have much more comprehensive service model solutions. So you've got to know how you're going to be paid, and very often your salesman is also the person who's physically delivering the goods and collecting the money. And so you can't separate sales from supply chain, from credit control, anything like how you can in Western markets. And that produces an extra level of complexity, but also, in fact, an extra level of opportunity, because you've got to have a solution which isn't just about physical networks, but is how you're going to get paid, how you're going to hold inventory, how you're going to plan, how you're going to forecast. And that's going to be an issue which could feed back very interestingly into how Western markets exist, because in effect there's a lot more variety in those developing markets of how you get the product to customer. I think too many consumer goods businesses have simplified their service model in Western markets and actually could play some games that they could learn from developing markets that would enable them to do things differently. So I think that's it. Again, there'll be some really interesting stuff, but actually a lot of it will be learning from those countries, those markets.
Would you say to an extent that supply chain segmentation could apply on a regional level as well as country level when we're talking about emerging?
Well, I mean, I think segmentation is sufficiently elastic that it is all the ways that we need to configure to meet, the fact that we'll have a single factory in the world, maybe, or a few factories, one that's for the globe, another group of products is regional and some are even local, combined with a huge variety of customers and end markets and what the customer wants and whether they want fashionable products or whether they want really cheap staples. And broadly speaking, companies will need to be able to provide all of those. And that's what segmentation is about. How do I put all of those things into one supply chain and make it work without, blowing everyone's mind? And the first thing is being just clear what it is you're trying to do. All the rest is quite difficult as well.
Okay. Well, John, thank you very much for allowing us to interview you today.
Pleasure.
Very insightful.
Thank you.